Before the cross, before the crescent, there were voices older than time, carved in flame, bone, and drum. They spoke not through scripture, but through rhythm. They wrote no books, yet etched the divine into the shape of rivers, the silence of mountains, and the breath of trees. These voices belonged to gods, creators, cosmic architects whose names pulsed through Africa long before religion claimed dominion over the spirit. This is not a story of mythology. It is a story of memory, a story buried under conquest, wrapped in shame, and forgotten in translation. And now it is being remembered. What if the world's first idea of God didn't come from the East or the West? What if it rose from Africa, from the Earth's navel, where humankind first stood upright and gazed into the stars? What if the oldest prayers were not said in Latin or Hebrew, but in languages no longer spoken, yet still felt? What if the divine wore kente and cowrie shells, danced through possession, and arrived not with thunder alone, but in the hush of dusk and the cry of birth? This is a journey not of conversion, but of restoration. We are not here to dismantle faith, but to uncover its roots. Beneath the sanctuaries of modern worship lie ruins of older truths, sacred truths whispered by griots and guarded by priestesses, protected in the bones of ancestors, forgotten gods, hidden names, stolen memories. This is their story. This is our story. The world has long told us where divinity began. But what if those maps were drawn by those who feared the center of the world? What if Africa, so often cast as a spiritual recipient, was in fact the original author of the sacred? Before prophets and disciples, before commandments and crusades, there were altars made of stone and spirit. There were gods who governed the wind, the harvest, the soul. These gods were not distant. They were familial. They lived with the people. They fed and punished, guided and warned. They were not metaphors. They were memory, and memory once awakened cannot be silenced. This is the beginning, a call to remember what was buried, to hear the drums beneath the doctrine, to follow the echoes back to the source. Welcome to the story of the gods that were erased. Welcome to the return. Long before temples were built of marble and gods were sculpted in stone, the sacred was woven into the soil of Africa. It was here, in the oldest cradle of humanity, that the first questions about life, death, and the infinite were asked and answered. Africa was not just the birthplace of civilization, it was the birthplace of divinity. This continent did not wait for missionaries to bring the sacred, it gave birth to it. Its people did not need scripture to recognize the spirit. They felt it in the sun's rising heat, the river's eternal flow, the whisper of ancestors in the wind. Spirituality in Africa did not begin with doctrine, it began with existence itself. Spirituality in its most ancient form was not separated from life. It was life. It beat in the drums, danced through the bodies of the possessed, and settled in the silence between breaths. Before religion built walls between the sacred and the secular, African people lived in a world where everything was infused with spirit. Rocks held memory, trees carried messages, dreams revealed futures, and most importantly, the divine was not confined to the heavens. It was present among the people, in every element of the natural world. There were no books, but there was scripture. It lived in oral tradition, passed down through griots who held genealogies and cosmologies in their minds like sacred libraries. These griots were not mere storytellers. They were guardians of memory, keepers of ancestral wisdom, spiritual historians. Through their voices, the people remembered who they were and who they came from. Their chants were scripture. Their songs were theology. Their presence ensured that no god could be erased as long as someone still sang their name. The priests and priestesses of ancient Africa did not hide their rituals behind closed doors. They communed with the spirits in public ceremonies, their bodies trembling with divine energy, their voices speaking with the tongues of gods. Trance was not madness. It was sacred encounter. Possession was not fear. It was favor. Ancestral priesthoods kept the spiritual systems alive, calling down the divine into everyday life, balancing the seen with the unseen. From this vibrant landscape of spirit emerged some of the world's oldest and most powerful deities. Olodumare, in the Yoruba tradition, is the supreme creator, pure, distant, and unknowable, yet the source of all energy and existence. Olodumare does not interfere directly in the world but delegates divine tasks to the Orisha, a pantheon of deities who govern nature, justice, love, war, and more. This structure reflects a deep understanding of cosmic hierarchy, balance, and the delegation of divine responsibility, mirrored in systems that much later emerged in other religions across the globe. Among the Dogon of Mali, Amma stands as the original creative force, whose acts brought the cosmos into order. Amma's creation story is poetic and complex, involving spiraling movement, twin spirits, and sacred geometry that astonishingly aligns with modern astronomy. The Dogon are said to have known of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, long before telescopes could confirm its existence. Their cosmology was not guesswork. It was revelation, inherited knowledge encoded in spiritual narrative. The Fon people of Benin speak of Mawu-Lisa, the dual god who embodies both masculine and feminine principles. Mawu, the moon, is gentle and nurturing. Lisa, the sun, is strong and protective. Together, they form a divine whole, symbolizing the necessity of balance, the unity of opposites. This concept of divine duality predates the gender binaries imposed by Western thought and offers a fluid, holistic view of divinity as both creation and correction, strength and softness, action and rest. Nzambi Mpungu, venerated by the Bakongo people, is both the high god and the sustaining force of the universe. Nzambi is not only in heaven, but also in water, in wind, in the breath of life. The Congo cosmology uses the Dikinga, or cosmogram, a sacred cross within a circle, to describe the cycles of birth, life, death, and rebirth. This spiritual map is not metaphorical, it is metaphysical. It teaches that life is circular, that the spirit transitions through phases, and that the ancestors walk in parallel with the living. Roog, the supreme being in the Sera religion of Senegal, is beyond image, beyond language. Roog is not male or female, not near or far. Roog is essence. The Sera people believe in the divine's inaccessibility and rely on ancestral spirits and intermediaries for guidance. Yet, Roog remains the source of all. This concept, in which the divine is both immanent and transcendent, is echoed across various African traditions and later resurfaces in mystical branches of monotheistic faiths. At the heart of all these traditions lies the concept of balance. African spirituality does not obsess over absolute good or evil. It is concerned with harmony, between nature and humanity, between the living and the dead, between the masculine and the feminine, between the visible and the invisible. The gods are not perfect, and they are not expected to be. They are powerful, and they are purposeful. They act in the world, they respond to prayer, they challenge and they bless. They represent archetypes that are deeply human and entirely divine. Elemental guardianship is also central to African divinity. Every river, mountain, and storm has a spiritual custodian. This connection to nature is not poetic, it is literal. To disrespect nature is to disrespect the divine. Sacred groves are temples, waterfalls are altars. The land is not just property, it is living history, it is God's body. African cosmologies did not separate God from creation. They saw creation as the evidence of God, and each part of nature was treated with reverence accordingly. This was a theology without a temple, a priesthood without robes, a scripture written in soil and sun, in ritual and rhythm. It was complex, yet simple, deep, yet accessible. It did not need to convert, because it did not need to compete. It existed because it was true, because it worked, because it was felt. The African gods did not demand belief. They demanded relationship. And through that relationship, generations were guided, communities were held, and the divine remained near. Africa was not waiting to be saved. It was already sacred. Before the world knew God by other names, Africa had already spoken the divine into being. These gods, these creators, these ancestral spirits, they were not fantasy. They were foundation. And though many have tried to erase them, they remain embedded in the memory of the land, in the breath of its people, and in the pulse of a spirituality that predates religion itself. This was the first altar, and it is still standing. In African cosmology, creation was not a one-time act performed by a distant deity. It was an ongoing process, a cycle that repeated through birth, growth, death, and rebirth, endlessly unfolding in rhythm with the earth, sky, and spirit. African metaphysics does not separate the sacred from the material. Instead, it fuses them. Life itself is evidence of divine will. The The universe is not a random explosion but a carefully balanced system, orchestrated by unseen forces and maintained through cosmic law. These spiritual systems, passed down through generations, speak not only of how the world came to be, but why it continues to be. And unlike many religious frameworks that reduce creation to a single narrative or a single god, African cosmologies present a layered, symbolic, and deeply interconnected understanding of reality. At the core of this understanding lies the tree of life. Not merely as a symbol, but as a metaphysical structure. Across various African cultures, the tree represents connection. Its roots dig into ancestral memory, its branches reach toward divine knowledge, and its trunk holds the present moment. In Yoruba tradition, the sacred tree, e.g. Arun, represents the axis mundi, the connection between the physical realm and the spiritual one. It is where ancestors dwell, where prayers are offered, and where spirits descend. This tree is not just a botanical entity, it is the map of life, illustrating how all things, living and dead, seen and unseen, are part of a divine ecosystem. Duality is another foundational principle in African cosmology, especially in relation to gender. Rather than promoting hierarchy, African spiritual systems emphasize balance. The concept of complementary opposites runs deep. In the Fawn tradition, Mawu-Lisa represents both moon and sun, female and male, coolness and heat. Their union is not only romantic, it is cosmic. Together, they maintain universal order. This sacred duality appears again in the balance of day and night, water and fire, sky and earth. In contrast to Western theology, which often masculinizes God and marginalizes the feminine, African traditions embrace gendered divinity in full force. The feminine is not a helper, it is half of the divine. The role of ancestors within these cosmologies cannot be overstated. Ancestors are not simply the dead, they are ever-present guides, spiritual architects, keepers of order. In African thought, you do not die and disappear, you transition. Your presence shifts from the visible to the invisible, but your influence remains. Ancestral spirits offer wisdom, blessings, and warnings. They are consulted before major decisions. They are honored in ceremonies. Their graves are not endings, they are gateways. And through rituals and libations, they remain active participants in the world they helped build. The Yoruba Ifa tradition offers one of the most elaborate systems of divine communication and creation mythology. Ifa verses are not just chants, they are coded spiritual blueprints. Each Odu, divinatory sign, holds stories, proverbs, and teachings that explain moral order, natural phenomena, and cosmic principles. These verses do not offer linear narratives, but cyclical wisdom. Unlike Genesis, which presents a six-day creation followed by divine rest, Ifa teaches that creation is continuous. The Orisha, or divine emissaries, are constantly involved in shaping human destiny. Olodumare, the supreme being, remains distant but is ever aware, while Orisha like Obatala, Orunmila, and Ogun carry out specific functions, guiding, creating, destroying, and healing. This divine delegation forms a hierarchy but not of power, of purpose. Each being has a role and every role is sacred. Among the Dogon people of Mali, cosmology reaches astonishing scientific depth. Their creation story begins with Amma, the creator, who shaped the universe from a single seed. This seed split, multiplied, and spiraled into stars, planets, and beings. The Dogon understand the Sirius star system in detail, including Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye and only confirmed by Western science in the 20th century. Yet, the Dogon had already encoded this knowledge into ritual, myth, and art. To them, Sirius is not just a star. It is a portal, a spiritual center of origin, the heart of Amma's creation. Their ceremonies honor the movement of celestial bodies, not as astronomers but as theologians. For the Dogon, the stars are the ancestors' eyes, watching, remembering, illuminating paths unseen. These cosmologies organize the divine into a hierarchy that reflects the complexity of existence. At the top is the creator, Olodumare, Amma, Rug, Nzambi, distant yet foundational. Beneath them are intermediary spirits, Orisha, Vodou, Nkisi. These beings manage the elements, enforce justice, heal the sick, and balance human life. They are followed by nature spirits, guardians of rivers, forests, mountains, and winds. Every tree may have its spirit, every river its deity. And finally, the ancestors, whose guidance completes the divine structure. This hierarchy is not rigid but relational. It mirrors the African family unit, where elders, adults, children, and ancestors all have roles, rights, and responsibilities. To maintain this divine order, Africans developed intricate systems of sacred symbolism. Masks are not decorations, they are portals. They transform the wearer into a god, allowing divine energy to enter the human body. In ritual dances, these masks become alive. The rhythm of the drums, the movement of the dancers, and the collective chant of the people create a moment where time dissolves and the spiritual becomes tangible. Each step, each gesture is deliberate. Ritual is not performance, it is law. It is how cosmic balance is restored and reaffirmed. Body art, such as scarification and paint, often serves spiritual functions. Certain symbols painted on the skin before ceremony act as divine armor or as invitations for possession. Colors are sacred. Red may signify power or danger, white for purity or ancestral presence, blue for the divine waters. Beads are prayers, drums are conversations with the unseen, and dance is not for entertainment, it is communion. In these expressions, African people did not need temples, they became them. Every act in these spiritual systems is encoded with divine intention. Marriage, birth, death, planting, harvesting, all are ritualized. The everyday becomes sacred. And in this way, African cosmologies teach not only about the origins of the world, but about how to live in it, respectfully, responsibly, and relationally. There is no separation between spiritual and social, between religious and political, between nature and deity. Everything is woven into a single fabric, and the divine thread runs through all of it. This cosmological view offers a counter-narrative to the linear, patriarchal, and often punitive doctrines that followed colonization. It presents an ancient theology that is relational, ecological, feminine, balanced, and astronomically precise. It is a spirituality of the stars and the soil, of the drumbeat and the dream. These systems do not require belief in the Western sense, they require participation. And those who participate step into a rhythm older than history, where creation is not a past event, but a present song, still unfolding, still sacred. The erasure did not begin with a sword, it began with a whisper. A whisper that told people their gods were wrong, that their prayers were noise, that their ancestors were damned. It came not only through colonization, but through Christianization, the reshaping of African minds to see the sacred as sinful, and the divine as demonic. What was once the heartbeat of African life became a target for suppression. The gods who had walked with people for generations were suddenly seen as devils. Their stories were now heresies, their images, abominations, their altars, blasphemies. And those who honored them were branded as heathens, witches, and savages. When missionaries arrived on African soil, they did not come simply with Bibles. They came with a mandate, a spiritual conquest. They saw the vibrant spiritual systems of the continent, not as expressions of divine truth, but as obstacles to be dismantled. The Orisha of the Yoruba, the Vodou of Dahomey, the Nkisi of the Congo were not understood, let alone respected. They were renamed, mistranslated, and demonized. Eshu, the divine trickster and messenger of the Yoruba, was reduced to the devil, a crude mischaracterization that erased his role as balance keeper, communicator, and divine intermediary. Masks used to summon spirits were labeled as satanic. Drums became instruments of chaos. Possession became a sign of madness or evil. The rich and nuanced spiritual world of African people was flattened into one word: idol. Shrines that had stood for centuries were burned. Temples carved from memory and soil were destroyed. Sacred artifacts were either looted or desecrated. What could not be physically destroyed was attacked spiritually. Oral teachings, the bedrock of African theology, were ridiculed and dismissed. Elders were pressured to abandon their roles. Priests and priestesses were silenced. Knowledge that had been passed from tongue to ear across generations was interrupted, mocked, and eventually forgotten by many. The colonizers understood something powerful. If you erase a god, you erase a people. You disconnect them from their source, their story, their sense of self. The colonizers' aim was not just to rule over bodies, it was to rule over memory. European theology clashed violently with African cosmology. Where African systems saw divinity in multiplicity, European doctrine demanded singularity. There could only be one God, one truth, one book, one way. The rest, they said, was evil. This fear of divine multiplicity revealed a deeper insecurity, an inability to comprehend that truth could exist in many forms. African spirituality thrived on balance and complexity. It made space for contradictions. It honored both male and female aspects of divinity. It understood that light and shadow were both sacred. But the missionaries brought a theology obsessed with binaries: heaven or hell, saved or damned, Christian or pagan. There was no room for nuance, no room for Africa. And so began the slow poisoning of identity. Africans were taught to feel shame for the rituals their ancestors had performed with pride. They were told that the names of their gods were curses, that their drumming summoned demons, that their dreams were dangerous. Generations of children were taught to laugh at their grandparents' beliefs, to shun their own spiritual inheritance. Colonization did not just take land, it took language, heritage, and soul. It replaced sacred symbols with foreign ones. It painted saints with white skin and called them saviors. It translated sacred songs into hymns that stripped away the rhythm and rootedness of African sound. It was a theft not of property, but of memory. Even names were stolen. Africans baptized into Christianity were often given European names to signify their rebirth in the true faith. Traditional names, rich with meaning and ancestry, were discarded. Names that once invoked rivers, gods, and family lineage were replaced with names of conquerors and kings from lands they had never seen. The gods of Africa were not only erased from the spiritual sphere, they were erased from the very syllables people used to call themselves. But erasure was not always violent. Sometimes it was subtle. A Bible given as a gift, a church built near a village, a school lesson that began with prayer, but only to one God. Slowly, generation by generation, the old ways were called backward, the old wisdom was called primitive, and the gods who had once ruled with dignity were consigned to the realm of superstition. The shame grew deeper, and with it, silence. People stopped speaking the names, they stopped dancing the rituals, they stopped pouring the libations. The gods, once everywhere, became nowhere, not because they had vanished, but because the people had been taught to forget. Yet the truth remained, even if buried. In secret, in dreams, in distant memories, the old gods whispered. They appeared in visions. They lived in stories that could not be completely silenced. They survived in the diaspora, in the chants of enslaved people who hid their gods behind the faces of saints. They survived in the rhythm of the drum, in the healing hands of midwives, in the language of elders who refused to forget. Because to forget would be to lose not just gods, but oneself. To erase a god is to erase a people. The process of erasure was methodical, calculated, and cruel. It was designed to make African people ashamed of their own divinity. It was a war not only of guns, but of spirits. And though it succeeded in many ways, it never fully won. Because what is divine cannot be destroyed. It can be hidden, it can be renamed, but it will always return. This is not only a history lesson, it is a reckoning. It is a reminder that what was stolen can be reclaimed, that what was silenced can be spoken again. The gods may have been erased from the page, but not from the pulse. They live in memory, they wait in rhythm. They rise in those who dare to remember. The war on African spirituality was not fought solely with fire and sword. It was waged in symbols, stories, and shame. It was a campaign of distortion, where reverence was rebranded as fear, and sacred names were twisted into warnings. At the heart of this erasure was demonization, the deliberate transformation of African gods into devils. Where once these spirits were guides, guardians, messengers, and healers, they were now recast as agents of evil. Their rituals were labeled as witchcraft, their followers as possessed, and their traditions as threats to salvation. This was not an accident. It was psychological warfare, precise, intentional, and devastating. The most tragic and well-known example of this distortion lies in the rebranding of Eshu, a central figure in Yoruba cosmology. Eshu is a complex deity, a trickster, a messenger between worlds, the keeper of the crossroads. He governs choice, duality, communication, and consequence. In Yoruba thought, Eshu is not evil. He is essential. Without him, prayers cannot be delivered to the heavens. Without him, no ritual can begin. But when missionaries encountered Eshu, they did not seek to understand him. They renamed him. They called him the devil, equating his unpredictable nature with malevolence, ignoring the profound philosophical role he played in the balance of cosmic justice. This deliberate misinterpretation stripped Eshu of his dignity and turned him into a warning label, an embodiment of the very chaos he once managed. A similar fate befell Legba, a spirit central to the Vodou tradition. Like Eshu, Legba stands at the spiritual crossroads. He is the gatekeeper, the opener of ways, the one who allows communication between the human world and the divine. In Haitian Vodou, Legba is revered, petitioned, respected. But to colonial missionaries, his role was too mysterious, too powerful, too unorthodox. They equated his presence with that of Satan, calling his invocations dangerous and his symbols diabolical. Statues of Legba, once sacred representations of divine communication, were cast down or hidden. His songs were banned. His followers were demonized. And so, a god of passage was turned into a demon of deception. African goddesses and queens, too, suffered under this regime of spiritual rebranding. Where once they ruled with strength and wisdom, they were recast as seductresses, temptresses, or witches. Female divinity, so central to African cosmology, was especially threatening to patriarchal religions that viewed power as inherently male. Goddesses like Oshun, who represents beauty, fertility, and the sacred river in Yoruba tradition, were trivialized as vain or promiscuous. Mami Wada, revered across West and Central Africa as a spirit of water and healing, was depicted as a dangerous mermaid, a temptress luring men to their doom. These narratives did more than distort. They instilled fear, especially in women, who were taught to distance themselves from their own spiritual power. The divine feminine was no longer a source of creation. It became a source of suspicion. Totemic symbols, sacred masks, and spiritual dances were all swept into this storm of demonization. What was once a holy performance became, in the eyes of colonial rulers and Christian missionaries, a spectacle of evil. Masks worn during ceremony, crafted to embody ancestors, channel spirits, and teach sacred truths, were labeled as pagan or satanic. These masks were not mere art. They were vessels of power. When worn, they allowed the divine to speak through the human. But in colonial reports, they were described as grotesque, unsettling, and dangerous. Missionaries confiscated them, destroyed them, or sent them to museums where they were stripped of context and labeled as primitive artifacts. The dances that once summoned rain, healed sickness, or honored the dead were cast as madness, perdition, or devil worship. Drum once echoed the heartbeat of the earth were silenced, replaced with European hymns and imported harmonies. This distortion had consequences far beyond ritual. It rewired the way people thought, felt, and prayed. It conditioned generations to flinch at their own heritage. It made reverence into fear, and made fear into a form of control. If your gods are demons, then your culture is cursed. If your ancestors practiced evil, then you must abandon everything they knew. This lie was internalized. Children grew up ashamed of their traditions. Elders died without passing on their knowledge. Entire communities fractured under the weight of spiritual confusion. The colonizers had done more than steal land. They had planted a seed of self-doubt that would take centuries to unearth. The psychological warfare was subtle and insidious. It was in the sermons that compared ancestral practices to hellfire. It was in the classrooms that taught Christian history but skipped over African thought. It was in the laws that banned indigenous religions. It was in the films, books, and media that portrayed African rituals as dark, savage, and unnatural. This conditioning led many Africans to reject their own gods before they even knew their names. It created a spiritual amnesia, a forgetting that felt like progress but was really exile. And yet, even as the gods were demonized, they endured. They adapted. They hid in plain sight. In the diaspora, they were cloaked in Catholic imagery. Eshu became Saint Anthony. Oshun appeared as Our Lady of Charity. Legba stood beside St. Peter. These transformations were not defeats, they were strategies. Ways to survive, ways to continue speaking, praying, existing. In secret altars and whispered names, the gods waited. Not for worship, but for remembrance. Because what was once sacred cannot be unmade. It can be misnamed, it can be feared, but it cannot be killed. To turn gods into devils is to turn power into poison. But the truth cannot remain buried forever. In today's world, the veil is lifting. People are returning to the crossroads. They are asking old questions, they are hearing old songs, and they are remembering that the gods who once walked with them are still here, waiting, watching, and ready to be known again. Demonization was never about theology. it was about power. And reclaiming these gods is not about rebellion. It is about healing, it is about justice, it is about truth. The gods never left, they just waited. They waited in silence, in shadows, in the songs of grandmothers, and the rhythm of drums that never stopped echoing. They waited in the margins of colonized faiths, behind stained glass saints who wore their names in disguise. They waited in the bloodlines of those who forgot how to speak to them but still felt their presence in dreams, in nature, in longing. And now they are returning, not as ghosts or relics, but as living, breathing forces in a world that tried to erase them. This return is not a myth, it is a movement. It is happening across oceans, across generations, across identities. The forgotten gods are rising through memory, music, ritual, and resistance. In the African diaspora, their return began in secret. Through the brutal rupture of slavery, millions of Africans were torn from their homelands and scattered across the Americas and the Caribbean. Their bodies were shackled, but their spirits were not. They carried their gods with them, hidden in prayer, veiled in song, disguised in the names of Catholic saints. In Cuba, the Orisha found new expression through Santeria, where Shango thundered beneath the altar of Saint Barbara and Yamaya wept behind the Virgin of Regla. In Haiti, the Loa were reborn in Vodou. Papa Legba opened gates not just to spirits but to survival. Urzali nurtured the brokenhearted. Ogu armed the oppressed. In Brazil, Candomblé preserved the old ways through dance, music, and ritual. These were not reinventions, they were resurrections. The gods had never left. They had only adapted to endure. Now, in the 21st century, this hidden worship is emerging from the margins and stepping into the light. A new generation of Africans and people of African descent are reclaiming what was once considered dangerous, shameful, or obsolete. African youth are turning toward Ifa, Vodou, and ancestral rituals, not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. They are finding in their roots a truth that was denied to their parents and mocked by their textbooks. The internet has become a tool of spiritual memory. Platforms once filled with colonial doctrine now host conversations about Orisha worship, ancestral veneration, and indigenous rituals. People are learning how to cast cowrie shells, read Odu, offer libations, and call names that had not been spoken aloud for 100 years. Academics are joining this wave of return, not as masters of forgotten knowledge, but as apprentices to ancient wisdom. Scholars are rediscovering cosmograms etched into the earth by the Congo people, maps of spiritual transformation that predate colonization and yet align with the most intricate of sacred geometries. They are decoding divination systems that rival Western astrology in complexity and nuance. They are unpacking sacred mathematics, lunar calendars, symbolic linguistics, all embedded in African spiritual tradition long before it was called primitive by colonial eyes. This academic revival is not detached analysis, it is reverent scholarship. It is the recognition that Africa was never without science, logic, or metaphysics. It simply named them differently, lived them differently, embodied them differently. Culture has become the vessel through which these gods are reintroduced to the world. Fashion designers are creating garments inspired by Orisha energy, red and white for Shango, blues for Yamaya, golden adornments for Oshun. Runways have become altars. Artists are painting deities not as distant mythic figures, but as powerful black bodies, wrapped in tradition, radiating divinity. Musicians are sampling traditional chants and integrating ancient rhythms into modern beats. Hip-hop, Afrobeats, jazz, and soul carry the energy of gods who once ruled over drumming circles and fire-lit ceremonies. The spiritual is now aesthetic, and the aesthetic is spiritual. Film and literature are awakening too. Writers are crafting stories rooted in Ifa cosmology, embedding Eshu's riddles and Obatala's wisdom into novels, screenplays, and poems. Filmmakers are reimagining African mythology not as fantasy, but as living theology. Documentaries are being made, archives are being built, and cultural festivals are reclaiming ancestral rituals once lost to colonial fires. Even in the West, where African spirituality was once whispered in shame, temples are being rebuilt, ceremonies held openly, and children named after gods who once had to hide behind saints. This is more than a trend, it is a spiritual resurrection. It is not a rejection of other faiths, but a rejection of forgetting. It is the right to remember, to honor, to speak the names of one's gods without fear, to to wear their colors, sing their songs, practice their rituals without apology. This return is both intimate and collective. It is the personal act of lighting a candle for the ancestors and the communal act of dancing barefoot in a public square to call down the spirits. It is the healing of a fracture that began with chains, ships, and scripture used as a whip. The gods are not coming back to conquer. They are coming back to connect. To remind a fractured people that their story did not begin with slavery or colonization, but with the stars, the soil, and the sacred. They are returning, not as idols, but as ideas, as energies, as ancestral presences calling for restoration. To reclaim these gods is not to look backward. It is to look inward, to ground oneself in truth and tradition, to remember that before we were broken, we were whole. The gods never left. They waited in the silence of erased stories, in the breath between songs, in the dreams that carried symbols we did not yet know how to read. And now we read them, we speak them, we wear them, we live them again. This is the return of the forgotten gods, and with them comes the return of self, of soul, of sovereignty. The spiritual resurrection has begun, not with trumpet blasts or temples of gold, but with memory, and memory once awakened becomes unshakable. These were not myths, they were memories. Not gods of imagination, but gods of identity. Before you were conquered, you were connected. This is not simply the closing of a documentary, it is an opening. A door, slightly ajar, into something older than any book and deeper than any doctrine. The names spoken here are not relics. They are rhythms. They are the sound of your blood remembering. They are the breath of ancestors who once danced barefoot beneath a sky lit not by stars alone, but by spirit. And now, as you sit in the silence that follows these words, listen not only with your ears, but with your bones. Because memory does not live in language alone, it lives in the body, the blood, the unseen space between heartbeat and breath. We now offer this prayer, not in the language of conquest, but in the language of return. O divine ancestors, creators, keepers of cosmic order, spirits who walked before us and made paths from stars and dust, we call to you now not in fear, but in remembrance. Olodumare, Amma, Mawu-Lisa, Nzambi Mpungu, Rug, names once buried, now spoken with reverence. Come near, not to judge, but to guide. May your wisdom pour into us like rivers that never forget their source. May we see with ancestral eyes, hear with ancestral ears, walk with ancestral rhythm. To those who bled for our forgetting, we light this flame. To those who whispered prayers in chains, we raise this chant. To those whose names were banned, we carve them back into the sky. We honor you not in perfection, but in persistence. May our memory become your altar. May our breath become your hymn. Ash. To you who have traveled with us through these 30 minutes of history, spirit, and soul, thank you. You are more than a viewer. You are a witness, a carrier of memory, a spark in a fire meant to never go out. If what you've heard today has stirred something in you, an ache, a curiosity, a pull, then don't let it fade. Let it grow. Speak a name. Comment below. Which god, which story, which rhythm resonated with you? What memory rose to the surface? What spirit tapped your shoulder? And if you feel that this story, the story of the gods that were erased, is a story that others need to hear, then share it. Not for clicks, not for likes, but for legacy. Share it to awaken memory. Share it for the silenced, the forgotten, the buried. Let their names travel again, not in chains, but in light. Subscribe, not because this channel needs numbers, but because you need memory. Because somewhere in the algorithms and the noise, there must still be space for soul. Subscribe to remember. Subscribe to reclaim. Subscribe so that no one else has to be taught that their gods were demons, that their ancestors were ignorant, that their spirit was small. Thank you for your time, for your attention, for your presence. Time is the most sacred offering we have, and you have given it to this moment, this remembering. May it bless you in return. May your dreams become clearer. May your questions grow deeper. May your walk feel guided. The gods are not gone, they live in your memory. Waiting, Ash.